All right, Alex, you can go ahead and take us away.
Perfect. So if it's okay for you, I will just start. And hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to this new meeting of our seminar series, being singular, historical, and theoretical perspectives. It's organized by myself and Gregory Scott Moss. We are very happy today to have as a guest Matt Duncan. I will say a few words about him in a few seconds. For now, I just have to say we had a very beautiful start. We are very excited, and this is the second year going with this seminar series, and we really look forward to having some results printed, to continuing this discussion, and some great insights have came out for now. So we are really proud and happy to be doing this with you, together with you all. Many thanks to all of you who are present on YouTube and on here on Zoom. So today's talk is by Matt Duncan. We have a few people coming in, so I will just let them in very quickly. Matt Duncan is professor of philosophy at Rhode Island College and is also the organizer of the New England Workshop on Metaphysics, which takes place every year. He's an expert on metaphysics and philosophy of mind. I've had the great pleasure of getting to know him in Freiburg in Switzerland for a workshop on a book he's been working on for a while now. And I've had the privilege to be able to read some chapters of this book as a preview. And I must say I'm very excited about it. And I also immediately saw a connection to the topics of this seminar. That's why, together with Greg, we decided to invite him. So yeah, Matt is an expert, I'd say a leading expert in the topic of acquaintance, and maybe he will tell us something about it in in a bit. Is also that with other questions. For instance, I'm very excited to read his articles on animalists. There are a few publications on the topic of animalism, and I'm very interested in it. So I will read them as soon as possible. But for today, the topic of his presentation is singularity and acquaintance. Matt, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. You have the floor. This will be around 40 minutes to 1 hour presentation, and then we will have a discussion. Again, thank you. You have the floor.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. This is already shaping up to be a really interesting series, and I'm definitely glad to be part of it. So I'm going to approach the topic of the series, singularity, by putting it in contact with this other notion, acquaintance, roughly, and I'll say more about this in a bit. Acquaintance is that relation of direct conscious awareness that you bear to things that you're aware of most immediately. You can think of simple examples, I don't know, like the colors and shapes that you experience, also, sensations like pain or an itch or something like that. Um, so that's what acquaintance is. And what I'm curious about is how we should understand the nature of the things we're acquainted with. Specifically, are they singular? Are they particulars? Or are they universals? Um, you might think this is some of you might think this seems like kind of a niche topic, kind of esoteric acquaintance, this technical term that Bertrand Russell introduced. But we could take a step back and think of it kind of more broadly as about the mind's most basic entryway into the world, the kind of point of first contact between us conscious subjects and the things around us. And the question then is, how should we understand those things, the nature of those things that we're have that first contact with? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So just to jump right in, here's Bertrand Russell, 1912, Problems of Philosophy. He says, we shall say that we have acquaintance with anything of which we are directly aware, without the intermediary of any process of inference or any knowledge of truths. Thus, in the presence of my table, I am acquainted with the sense data that make up the appearance of my table, its color, shape, hardness, smoothness, etc. All these are things of which I am immediately conscious when I am seeing and touching the table. Okay, so the first thing here is Russell's introducing the notion of acquaintance and what it is. It's direct conscious awareness. And right after introducing the notion of acquaintance, he says a bit about what we're acquainted with. And he's talking about particulars. So sense data, according to him, that's what we're most immediately aware of when, say, we're in contact with the table. These are individual particular objects that are generated by the mind due to our interaction with the world, our mind's interaction with the world, that we then are aware of in our kind of own private, non-physical space. So again, sense data are particulars. And he seems to think that this is the most obvious example. And then, you can see he's also talking about engagement with particular objects in his environment as what's causing the sense data. So that's what he seems to be interested in here when he introduces the notion. Then later he says this: in addition to our acquaintance with particular existing things, we also have acquaintance with what we shall call universals, that is to say, general ideas such as whiteness, diversity, brotherhood, and so on. So Russell, and we'll dig into the reasons why in a bit, but he seems to think we're also aware of universals. We're acquainted with universals. So that naturally raises a question, or maybe a series of questions, about is one of these more important or primary relative to the other? This is a question that came up somewhat vaguely at a panel I was on at the World Congress on Philosophy in Rome about acquaintance. And the issue got raised, and it seemed that several of the philosophers on the panel thought that acquaintance with particulars is somehow primary, more important, more fundamental, something like this. This included Uriah Kriegel, Emad Atik, Anna Justina, and myself. But then David Chalmers was on the flip side saying that he felt like in some important ways, universals, acquaintance with universals was more important and primary. And so this got me thinking about this topic, and as in a way the inspiration here. And so what I'm going to do is I want to highlight some reasons for thinking, one, that we're acquainted with particulars or universals, and why that's theoretically important. And then I want to actually come back to the vaguely stated question of which is more important and ask about the question itself, because I think I'm not only interested in the answer, I'm interested in what's the best question in the neighborhood, because there are a variety of different ways you could ask it in terms of, should one be eliminated in favor of the other? Is one more fundamental than the other? Different ways of asking the question. And then go back through and kind of dig into the motivations for thinking we're acquainted with particulars versus universals. And hopefully it's a bit exploratory, but hopefully something interesting will emerge. Okay, so first though, a little bit more background on acquaintance and what it is. So as I've said, direct conscious awareness of properties and objects. Paradigm cases come from perception and introspection. Really, there are two parallel but not always interacting literatures out there that appeal to the notion of acquaintance. One is literature on perception, where, especially say naive realists or direct realists talk about our being acquainted with ordinary physical objects around us. Other theories say that we're not acquainted with external things, but they posit other things that we're acquainted with when we have perceptual experiences. As we saw, Russell thought when we have a perceptual experience, table experience, what we're acquainted with are sense data. So this comes up in the topic of the metaphysics of perception. Then there's the introspection literature, the self-knowledge literature, where acquaintance theorists there say that we're acquainted with our own experiences, our own phenomenal properties, in an especially intimate way, maybe even more than anything we're acquainted with in perception, though that depends a lot on the view. So these are two areas when you think about things you might be acquainted. Think about having a perceptual experience, whatever it is you're aware of most immediately in those cases. And then your own experiences or your own phenomenal properties. That's another, pains, itches, tickles, whatever. Those are two areas where that provide paradigm cases of things we're acquainted with. There are other features, according to Russell and others, of acquaintance. I'm just kind of mentioning them as just to throw them out there, not to linger too much on them because they won't matter too much for our purposes. One is that for Russell, acquaintance is itself a kind of knowledge. It's not just that we are acquainted with things and that gives rise to beliefs that can amount to knowledge or justifies beliefs that can amount to knowledge or something like that. For Russell, acquaintance is itself a kind of knowledge. So experiencing things, again, if it's, colors and shapes or sensations or whatever, that is its own kind of knowledge. Now, I defend this view as well, and other people have been recently, though the dominant view in the decades prior has been more, no, acquaintance is just this relation that gives rise to beliefs that can amount to knowledge. So there's kind of disagreement about this. But anyway, that was Russell's view. He also thought it was especially secure and complete. And contemporary acquaintance theorists take up this idea in various forms and say that acquaintance provides especially secure knowledge of its objects. And we'll return to that for sure. And then also Russell was interested in this idea that acquaintance is a foundation for other knowledge. He defended in at least 1911, 1912, a kind of classic foundationalism where you have at the rock bottom knowledge by acquaintance that other knowledge, maybe all other knowledge, depends on, but that it itself does not depend on other knowledge. So it's kind of that bedrock. So these are some other views for the features associated with acquaintance that Russell defended. Okay, so with that, let's look at this question of what is it that we're acquainted with? Are they particular or are they universal? Let's start with particulars, and I say the benefits, and what I mean is reasons to think that we're acquainted with particulars. That's important theoretically. One is you might just think it's intuitive. So Russell says this in 1912, sense data supply the most obvious and striking example of knowledge by acquaintance. So he thinks that, acquaintance with, he's talking about sense data, and maybe you don't think sense data are particularly intuitive, but I think the idea of being acquainted with particulars is pretty intuitive and maybe even also less mysterious. It's one thing to have this sense that in experience you're aware of individuals around you. It's a little bit trickier to get your head around the idea that you would be directly aware of, acquainted with universals. So just from the get-go, you might think, in experience, it does seem as if we're acquainted with the things around us, that we're talking about particular objects and property instances. So there's just kind of an intuitiveness that is associated with acquaintance with particulars. It's also maybe a bit easier to make sense of how this knowledge could be especially secure and complete. So here's what Russell says. He says, I know the color of the sense datum perfectly and completely when I see it, and no further knowledge of it is even theoretically possible. Now, as we'll see, this is a controversial claim, but it's, not so hard to get a grip on it when you're thinking about particulars. You think like, oh, this individual that is directly before my mind, and I'm acquainted with it. I can see how that knowledge might be especially secure and complete. But if we're talking again about universals, it's a little bit harder to get in this headspace where you think about, no further knowledge of it is even theoretically possible. How would that be so? So insofar as acquaintance theorists are interested in defending this idea that knowledge by acquaintance is especially secure, you might think, well, we need to understand that in terms of acquaintance with particulars. All right, these are just a handful of reasons to think that acquaintance with particulars is important. There are others, and we can talk about that for sure, and I'll be curious what you might think are other reasons to think acquaintance with particulars is important. Here are some, on the flip side, reasons to talk about acquaintance with universals. I think maybe the primary one is breadth. So here's what Russell says. If knowledge of particular sense data were the sole example, our knowledge would be very much more restricted than it is. So Russell is interested, I mean, we're going to get to foundationalism, that's another thing, but this idea that acquaintance figures in a lot of our knowledge, and he thinks, well, if it's just particulars, that's not going to cover enough. And in fact, I think this is what Chalmers was concerned with when he was saying that acquaintance with universals is especially important. He thinks that we're acquainted with particulars in introspection, so we can be acquainted with particular phenomenal property instances. But then he thinks in perception we're acquainted with universals. So he, on a view like this, and it doesn't have to be that view, you might think that the acquaintance with the particulars is just this small specialized slice, for philosophers who are interested in certain domains. Not to say that that's not important, but that really if we're going for breadth, like how does acquaintance figure in our everyday knowledge of the world around us, then he thinks we're going to have to appeal to universals. And this is related to the issue of foundationalism. So Russell says all our knowledge, both knowledge of things and knowledge of truths, rests upon acquaintance as its foundation. All our knowledge. So this is one key motivation for Russell to talk about acquaintance with universals, because he's doubtful that you can really ground all of our knowledge in acquaintance with particulars, because at any given time, we're acquainted with just a handful of things. One more thing that is differently oriented has to do with hallucinations. So suppose, I've got this blue pencil here in front of me. Suppose instead of actually experiencing it, I'm hallucinating right now. I'm hallucinating, but it sure seems to me I'm acquainted with something. It's not a pencil. There's no pencil there. But you might think there's no particular there that will serve. So if you're wondering what I could be acquainted with when I'm hallucinating this blue pencil, one option is you're acquainted with universals, and certain philosophers of perception, representationalists say things like that. And then if you go that far, you might think, well, look, this is the exact same experience type as when I'm just having an experience of a blue pencil. So we should just say it's acquaintance with universals in every case. So hallucinations provide an entryway to think about universals as being the primary object of acquaintance. Okay, so again, just a handful of things on either side. We could dig into a lot of other things. And now the question is, which is primary? Again, a vaguely put question, and I think it's interesting to think about which question is the right question here. A couple of different ways to think about it. One, you could think, can one be eliminated in favor of the other? Could we just talk about acquaintance with particulars, or just talk about acquaintance with universals, and capture everything that we want to capture and have all the relevant theoretical roles played with only one or the other? Another way of thinking about it, I mean, Russell obviously didn't think that. He thought we were acquainted with both. Another way of thinking about it is, well, is one more fundamental than the other? And specifically, does one depend on the other? Does acquaintance with particulars depend on acquaintance with universals, or vice versa? So that would be another way of another kind of question to ask. Yeah, further one would be, is there some important theoretical role played by one or not the other? I mean, kind of as I was mentioning Chalmers, it kind of seems like, he does think that there's certain epistemic roles played by acquaintance with particulars, but he thinks some of the really important roles are played by acquaintance with universals. So that would be another way in which one could be primary relative to the other. Another kind of question that is related and seems kind of what Chalmers and others were interested in is a prevalence question. Is one more prevalent than the other? I mean, you could ask that, like, are we only rarely acquainted with particulars or universals or whatever? So I just highlight a bunch of different questions, not to say which is the right one, but just to, ask the question of what's the right question. And as we dig into some of the details here, maybe you'll have an idea of what the right question is, and then we can look at some answers. All right, so let's go back to acquaintance with particulars, and I want to consider some potential challenges to these so-called advantages of thinking about acquaintance as being with particulars, and then respond to those. So first, with this idea that acquaintance is intuitive and less mysterious, as we saw, Russell said this, sense data supply the most obvious and striking example of knowledge by acquaintance. But some people think acquaintance across the board is non-obvious and mysterious. So regardless of what it is acquaintance with, some people think we're already in the realm of mystery. So maybe this wouldn't be such an advantage for thinking about acquaintance, like you're already in mystery land, so it doesn't really matter whether it's particulars or universals. Fleshing that out a little bit, some of the things that you'll hear, people are worried about this idea that acquaintance is this primitive sui generis relation that can't be reduced to anything else. They're also concerned with the idea that it's wedded to dualism. Russell in 1911 and 12 was a dualist, and other defenders, other acquaintance theorists defend dualism. So people are concerned about that insofar as they're physicalists. And then just generally, they're concerned with this relation being non-natural. So these are some concerns about the mystery. I tend to think that this isn't such a concern, because if you really don't like dualism, if you're a naturalist, if you don't want the primitive relation, there are ways of trying to understand acquaintance in keeping with that. And various people have tried to give a naturalization, a reductive analysis of acquaintance, and I don't think we should rule that out from the get-go. Now, of course, other people have argued that no, we have to, it should be understood as a primitive. I mean, they give an argument for there being a primitive acquaintance relation. And so maybe they want that mystery. They think that there is that that kind of the primitive there. So it's just to say, if this is a concern for you, then there are ways of massaging that concern a bit. So I tend to think this is not such a worry for the acquaintance with particulars view. The other thing, knowledge is especially secure and complete. Russell said this, as I've mentioned, but I think the history of the last couple of decades in both psychology and philosophy, when it comes to especially self-knowledge, knowledge of your own mental states, your own experiences, has been one that's pretty critical of this idea. So if it's not true that this knowledge is especially secure and complete, as these philosophers and psychologists would have it, then this really wouldn't be an advantage for the acquaintance with particulars view. So let's just look at some of those criticisms in a little more detail. Some I'll just kind of mention, maybe they'll be familiar to you. One is people have empirical doubts. They cite all of these empirical results that show that people aren't particularly good at knowing, say, the causes of their experiences, or they can't forecast what they're going to feel in the future. They are also imperfect when it comes to reporting and describing their experiences. And so this has led people just to think that these claims of privileged access, especially the more extreme ones, like people who say that we can be certain, some things are beyond doubt, infallible, they think that's all mistaken, that really our self-knowledge ain't so good. I think most of these empirical concerns miss the mark insofar as they're meant to be criticisms of the acquaintance theory and some of the claims. And that's because sometimes they're a bit crude, even in that they don't really dig into what the acquaintance theorists are claiming. No acquaintance theorist claims that we can be certain of the causes of our experiences or what we're going to experience in the future. And indeed, they don't claim that we would be, or even predict that we would be infallible about reporting, describing, conceptualizing our experiences. Remember, for Russell and other acquaintance theorists, acquaintance is just direct conscious awareness of something. All the other stuff, describing, conceptualizing, reporting, that's further steps. That's not acquaintance. And when Russell is talking about acquaintance being especially certain, remember, he thinks that acquaintance is itself a kind of knowledge. And so he's saying that acquaintance relation is indubitable, beyond doubt. But of course, the further stuff, that's a different matter. So I think if we're just really careful about what the claims of privileged access here are, then the empirical doubts aren't really a problem. Another area of concern, a popular claim of the last few decades, is this transparency claim. And the idea is that when you try to attend to your own experiences, you find that you just attend to external things. So if it's like attend to your visual experience right now, you end up just attending to external things. And people have used this to contend that really what we're most directly aware of are external things, not our own mental states again. And if that's right, then you might, especially if the claims were about privileged access of your own mental states, you might think, well, you're not even aware of those, or and definitely not, or not most directly at least. And so that would seem to undermine the privileged access claims, at least some of them. I'm not a big fan of the transparency claim. I agree that when we attend to things, generally our attention is directed outward. But I think the inference from that to we're most directly aware of external objects and properties is no good. I mean, just think like sense datum theorists like Russell. He's going to agree that, yeah, your attention is directed outward. In fact, it is directed outward because a sense datum is an external thing to your mind, according to him. So it is directed outward. And yeah, he's going to say, you think you're attending to a table. Of course, it's just that actually the thing you're most immediately aware of are sense data. And he's not predicting that the phenomenology is any different than what a transparency theorist says. So anyway, that's just to say that the transparency claim, I think, is dubious. Furthermore, in order to really undermine the privileged access claim, it would have to be a pretty extreme version of the transparency claim where not only do we generally focus our attention outward, but that we always do, that maybe we couldn't focus inward. And that seems pretty implausible to me. I mean, think about your pain, the pain that you feel. Can you really not attend to the pain itself, the experience? It seems unlikely. So that's another concern that I think there's a response to. Let me mention another kind of concern that has gotten more attention recently. It comes from a kind of case that Adam Pautz introduced, and then David Chalmers also talks about as he talks about it as Eden. He imagines Eden in a 2013 paper. And it gets to some of these issues about certainty and knowledge of your own experiences. So here's what Chalmers imagines. He says, suppose that we're perceptually acquainted with sensible qualities of external objects. So, we look around and think, this pencil seems to have blue across its surface, and suppose that that really is the case, and I'm just directly aware of the blue itself in Eden. So, I mean, really, this is what naive realists say is the case. But so let's just suppose that's the case. This is what, Chalmers is calling Eden. You're perceptually acquainted with sensible qualities of external objects. Then he asks, would this acquaintance give us certainty that those sensible qualities are instantiated? To give us certainty, or could we be skeptical? Is there room for doubt in this scenario where we're assuming we're acquainted in the strictest sense with sensible qualities of external objects? Could we be certain that those are instantiated, or is this open to skepticism just like ordinary perceptual experiences? You either have to say yes or no. If you say no, you can't be certain, even in Eden, that say that lion is yellowish brown or whatever, or that color is instantiated. Then either Edenic experiences are phenomenologically different, or acquaintance doesn't ground certainty. So different from actual acquaintance experience. So that's the first option there, because if they're phenomenologically different, then you could say, oh, well, in actual cases it's like this. In Eden, it would be like that. So we can be certain in actual cases, even though we can't in Edenic cases. Now that first option there seems unprincipled because it's very natural, just given the setup of the case, to think we should just assume that um, the experiences would be phenomenologically the same. So the natural conclusion there is, hey, actually acquaintance does not ground certainty, contrary to what acquaintance theorists have said. Okay, that's if you say no. If you say, on the other hand, yes, in Eden, you can be certain that that color of the lion is instantiated, then again, either Edenic experiences are different from ordinary acquaintance experiences, or acquaintance with our experiences isn't special epistemically. So this is the kind of claim of acquaintance theorists about introspection, that there's this special access that we have to our own experiences that is different in principle than the perceptual access to external things. Whereas external things, yeah, you can be in the matrix, you could be dreaming, you could be in Inception or whatever, and you can doubt I can't doubt my own experiences exist though. So there's an idea that it's special. But if you think you could be certain in Eden, then it doesn't look like acquaintance with our experiences is special. So there's a kind of dilemma here. My preference is to go with no and say acquaintance does not ground certainty. Now, this might seem like a sad result. It seems like I'm giving up what acquaintance theorists want, but I don't think so. Let me just explain a little bit. So I actually think there are two potential routes to doubt. One is the usual one, where there's some kind of intermediary. So you're aware of X in virtue of being aware of Y, and Y is kind of misleading you about the nature of X, and so you can doubt that X is as it is. That could be one way that you doubt it, and that's the one that people typically talk about when they're talking about these scenarios. They talk about there being this intermediary. But I think that there's another one. To see this, consider naive realism. And again, naive realists think that the world is Edenic. Eden is the real world in that sense. But they're typically going to say that, yeah, like the Matrix, that makes sense. That's like we could be skeptical that the external world is as it appears. But then you might wonder, like, what would explain that? Why why is skepticism possible if you can be directly acquainted with the external world? And one answer, I think it's a plausible answer from naive realists, from Harold Langsom, and I guess maybe McDowell says things like this too, is that it's not because there's any intermediary between you and the external world, me and the external world. It's because you have these experiences that are phenomenologically indistinguishable from non-acquaintance experiences. So you are acquainted. I am directly acquainted with this pencil, this blue, and the blueness on it. But there could be another experience, like if I'm hallucinating, where it's just like this, but I'm not acquainted with the pencil. So that's another route to doubt. And so my thought is acquaintance, being directly aware of it, something, is not enough to ground certainty, because it still leaves room for this other route to doubt. All right, still it seems like, we're in hot water as far as the certainty claims go, but I think phenomenal properties are different. So I think in particular, phenomenal properties are individuated by the way they seem and appear in experience, by their phenomenology. So if you have an experience where you seem to be in pain, you just are in pain. And any experience that's phenomenologically indistinguishable from that experience is going to be one where indeed you're in pain. And the same goes for other phenomenal properties. If they're individuated and defined by the way they appear, then just by definition of what they are, that second route to doubt is foreclosed, because you couldn't have a phenomenally indistinguishable experience in which those phenomenal properties aren't instantiated. Just because, again, they're defined by the way they appear. So I think because of the nature of phenomenal properties, that second route to doubt is foreclosed. Acquaintance forecloses the first route to doubt. So I think really the picture should be that acquaintance plus the nature of phenomenal properties grounds certainty. That's what does it. Okay, so this is all just to say, here are some challenges to these reasons to prefer talking about acquaintance with particulars, and I think that there are responses that are plausible. Let's switch over to acquaintance with universals. We have breadth, foundationalism. Let's start with hallucinations, though, that issue. Remember, the issue is that when we hallucinate, there's not obviously any particular, if I'm hallucinating this, there's no pencil there, so it's not obvious there's any particular to be acquainted with. So that would be a reason to posit acquaintance with universals, insofar as you think, I'm sure I'm acquainted with something when I hallucinate the blue pencil. Now, one thing to note about this already, that little speech I just gave, like there's no particular to be acquainted with, that really presupposes something about the metaphysics of experience, because some views will say there are particulars for you to be acquainted with. I mean, the sense datum theory says that when you hallucinate, you're acquainted with a sense datum just as much as you are in ordinary veridical experience, and that's a particular. So it does depend a bit on the metaphysics of experience, and maybe others too, like qualia theory. Maybe you're acquainted with qualia, or adverbialism, you're aware of yourself sensing bluely or something like that. These can be particular. So depending on the view of the metaphysics of experience, there may be particulars for you to be acquainted with. Now, not many people are sense datum theorists these days. A lot of people prefer a different view, intentionalism or representationalism. And so that's going to be the view where you're going to want to posit universal. So we should look at that, but it's just at least worth pointing out that there's a presupposition. And indeed, there's another presupposition that's important. My little speech about the blue pencil and hallucinating it also presupposed that when you hallucinate, you're acquainted with something. Some representationalists, intentionalists say that actually, when you are acquainted with the blue pencil, you're not acquainted with anything. Maybe you think you are, or something like that, but you're not acquainted with anything. And that's important here too, because if you're not acquainted with anything, then there's no reason to posit acquaintance with universals. We could do without it. So that's another important presupposition. Now, with that said, it's a presupposition that I'm pretty attracted to. I mean, I think when I hallucinate this blue pencil, I am aware of something. It's not a pencil. I don't know what it is. It could be a variety of different things. But, H.H. Price thought like you could be certain that when you hallucinate, you're acquainted with something. And I think that there's some real force to that something here is blue. I don't know what it is I'm acquainted with. So that's just to say this is a presupposition, but I think as far as I am concerned, I think it's a very plausible presupposition. So this might get you back into okay, you're an intentionalist, you're acquainted with something. How about universals? But I actually think that's not a particularly helpful response, because yeah, representationalists who say that you're not acquainted, that say you are acquainted with something, what do they end up saying? They don't say you're acquainted with an instantiated universal, because they don't think there's any object there for you to be acquainted with. Instead, they say you're acquainted with uninstantiated universals. And this just boggles my mind. It's like, what, when I'm hallucinating, I have like some direct access to Plato's heaven? I mean, there are immanent universals maybe instead, but that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about instantiated universals. We're talking about you're acquainted with uninstantiated universals. And I think that doesn't do justice at all to the intuition that when you are hallucinating something, you're acquainted with something, because it seems like something here is blue. It's not just that, like, whoa, I'm acquainted with blueness itself. It's like, no, something's blue. I don't know what it is, but something's blue. So this is to say that I think the universals route to hallucinations ends up being somewhat dubious. So maybe not the best use of universals here. Now let's go to another way in which you might think acquaintance with universals versus particulars might be primary, and that's a kind of more theoretical sense. What I want to say is, even if we go with that kind of intentionalist package where we're acquainted with uninstantiated universals in hallucination, but not in ordinary vertical experience, I still think it's natural to think acquaintance with particulars in the good cases is primary. So one way in which it's primary is in this theoretical way. Epistemically, I think it's primary. So suppose again I'm hallucinating this, I mean, boring hallucination, hallucinating this pencil here, this blue pencil. And so because of that, I form this belief that there's a blue pencil in front of me. One question, epistemic question, is that belief justified or not? Maybe it's not, it's a hallucination after all. But there might be cases where it is justified. If I don't know that I'm hallucinating, then I might be justified in believing that there's a blue pencil here, even though there's not a blue pencil here. But there, it seems like the reason why I'm justified in believing that is sort of parasitic on the fact that that hallucination is mimicking a veridical experience, where there is a pencil there, and I am acquainted with a particular instantiation of blueness. So it seems like there it even just derives from the epistemic significance of acquaintance with particulars. So I think there's a way in which, even if you think we need to posit acquaintance with universals here, it's derivative and non-fundamental epistemically. I also want to say experiential justification. This is a claim I defend in my book. Experiential justification requires acquaintance with something. I mean, it could be universals for all I've said so far, or particulars, but it requires acquaintance with something. To get a sense of my reason for this, consider an analogy. Suppose you tell me that there is an apple in your office. So I believe that there's an apple in your office. But suppose there is no apple in your office. Still, my belief that there's an apple in your office may be justified. After all, you told me you're a reliable witness and all of that, even though it's not there. But notice that that presupposes and requires that I heard you say there's an apple in your office. If I didn't hear you say that, and I had no independent reason to think there's an apple in your office, then my belief wouldn't be justified. And indeed, if you said that there was an apple in your office, but I didn't hear it, still my belief wouldn't be justified. In order for it to be justified, I've got to hear it. So likewise, in the case of experience, I think if you hallucinate something and yeah, maybe you're not aware of a blue pencil, if that belief that there's a blue pencil in front of you is going to be justified, you got to be acquainted with something. Maybe you're acquainted with your experience saying that there's a blue pencil there. So in order for it to be, if you weren't acquainted with anything, then, and you had no independent justification for thinking there's a blue pencil there, then you wouldn't be justified in believing that. So experiential justification requires acquaintance with something, and I think a particular is always available. And the story I just told is one where it's very natural to think you're acquainted with your experience, your hallucinatory experience in that case. And that's a particular instantiation of a phenomenal property. So I think this is another reason to think that we might be able to do without acquaintance with universals here, or at least that more fundamental is acquaintance with particulars. Okay, these other issues with foundationalism and breadth, I have less to say about this right now. I mean, I've been thinking about it, but Russell, he says all our knowledge, both knowledge of things and knowledge of truth, rests upon acquaintance. And then you might think, well, in order to get that claim, you really need to appeal to acquaintance with universals. I think another alternative is to say that this claim is overblown. Here's a different version of foundationalism. Sorry, I know it's jargony, but that I defend in my book. I call it semi-strong acquaintance foundationalism. For any subject S and proposition P, if S knows P empirically, then there are objects and or properties x1 to xn such that one, S has knowledge by acquaintance of each of them, and two, S knows that P, at least in part because S has knowledge by acquaintance of each. So this doesn't say that all of our knowledge depends on acquaintance. It's only focused on empirical knowledge, so knowledge gained from perception and maybe also introspection. And I defend this claim. I think this claim is true, but it's not so general as Russell's claim. And to defend this claim, I don't think I need to appeal to universals at all. I think it can be defended just by appealing to the particulars that you're acquainted with in perceptual and introspective experience. So my thought with regard to the foundationalism thing is just to say, yeah, we should pull the reins back, and then there's not a problem. Okay, so here are the benefits of each, and I've kind of been comparing them. My own thought, which I've just been kind of lightly defending, I guess, is that acquaintance with particulars is primary. And as I said earlier, you could break this down into various different questions. I'm inclined to think acquaintance with particulars is more prevalent, is the more kind of commonplace thing in both introspection and perception. I'm also inclined to think that it plays certain theoretical roles, especially in metaphysics and epistemology, that acquaintance with universals doesn't. I'm also inclined to think that insofar as we have knowledge of universals, it depends on knowledge of particulars. That really, there's a kind of fundamentality thing going on there where the knowledge acquaintance with particulars is more fundamental. And then finally, I'm at least somewhat inclined to think that we could maybe even eliminate acquaintance with universals and say we have knowledge of universals, but it's not acquaintance. And that might make it difficult to defend Russell's version of foundationalism, but I'm not sure that is defensible. All right, that's kind of my take here. I'm very curious about your takes. There are further issues that I had been thinking about having to do with duplicates and foundationalist memory, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just end there, and I'll be curious to hear what you all think. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you, Matt, for this beautiful presentation. I believe you brought so much to the table, and there are so many issues to discuss. And I think we can just start the discussion right now. So the method is always the same. If somebody on Zoom has a question, please use the tool to raise your hand, or you can just, really raise your hand with your video on, or make yourself visible in some way. On YouTube, you can just write your question, and I or Gregory will read it out to you. So yes, I believe there is very much to discuss. I will just, annotize myself for the time being because I'm sharing this. So please, the floor is open if anybody wants to weigh in. Well, if there are no questions, I will happily ask a few myself. So, no, there is Jakub. Sorry, Jakub, please
Okay.
go on.
I don't know how to raise the hand in Zoom now. It's changed. The
No
application
worries.
is changed. My question is maybe a question of clarification. I'm pretty much with you that there is a problem with acquaintance with universals, and we should focus more on acquaintance with particulars. But what is exactly for you particular? Uh, it's even not clear in Russell, and there are many other accounts of what is the particular. Like you can think of Hegel or many other things. Uh, in one moment, you said uh, we have in the chapter or in the section on acquaintance with particulars that it's a direct awareness of or consciousness of properties and objects. What are these properties? Are there like properties instances, as you said, or then they might be it's already they might be universal. So uh, it's not that if you admit that we have awareness or we have acquaintance with property instances, then uh, our acquaintance with particulars is grounded in a property in acquaintance with universals. I think this is very vaguely Russell's argument. So I'm wondering what is your view here?
Yeah, good question. So yeah, I was thinking about particulars as individual objects and, as you say, property instances. Now you might say those property instances might be conceived of as universals, instantiated universals. And so in a way, it could kind of be both. But the thing I want to emphasize is that the acquaintance is with the instantiations, the particular instantiations. And so it's not acquaintance with universals as such, these abstracta. And so another way, I guess, of going is thinking of it as it really is tied to the individual object that you are acquainted with. Now, I get how someone might say, well, in a way that's just acquaintance with universals as well, and that's fine. I guess really at the end of the day, it may be that it's both, but then the question would be framed not in terms of acquaintance with universals versus particular, but like property instances versus uninstantiated universals. I mean, there are people like who are colory realists, for example, like Adam Pouts is going to say like nothing is red, but color experience involves acquaintance with universals that are instantiated in any case, whether it's vertical or not.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Jakob, for your question. Is there any other commentary, remark, question? Otherwise, I will. No, please, Gerd, go on.
Alex, if you want to ask first, it's fine.
No, please. I leave you. I leave you happily.
All right. So my fever brain here will. I'm just getting acquainted with this knowledge by acquaintance stuff. Sorry, I had to make a bad joke, so I had to. Although it's all very familiar. Sorry, the jokes keep coming. I'm gonna stop now. Yeah, I had a very similar question that Jakob asked, so he took my first question. So I'm very happy to hear that question. And I am myself, yeah, inclined maybe to put into terms of the acquaintance with instantiated properties or instantiated universals. But yeah, I really appreciated the talk. I wanted to ask some clarification question, and then I wanted to ask a question about the particular universal opposition. So my first question is whether you think, as an acquaintance theorist, that all knowledge is based on acquaintance. Because it seems that if you think of knowledge as either mediated or immediate, you can ask, well, the mediated knowledge is grounded on something else, or it's through something else. And you can ask, well, what's that grounded on? Well, some other mediated knowledge. This ultimately needs to bottom out in something immediate. or you'll have this infinite regress or something. So I don't know, it seems to me like a plausible claim or an argument can be made that all knowledge is ultimately based on some immediate relation, some kind of immediate knowing. And I'm just curious, is that the view that you hold, or do you think it's actually a plausible view? So the discussions about the nature of acquaintance is really discussion about the basis of all knowledge. My second question, maybe just to pick up on the question about the relation of particular to universal. I'm reminded of, so you mentioned that the knowledge of the universal, you're inclined to think that it depends on knowledge of particular. And then after hearing your answer to the last question, I was thinking about even when I'm acquainted with an uninstantiated universal, I guess if I could be just acquainted with an uninstantiated universal, this uninstantiated universal is still instantiating, it's still instantiating a universal. It's instantiating universality, right? So even in this case, my acquaintance is with a particular. I actually don't think I can ever be acquainted with anything that isn't particular. And what I mean is that even the uninstantiated universal is the acquaintance with, yeah, with the instantiation of universality. So my sense is to say that particularity is absolute, that actually there's no way to remove it from acquaintance, full stop. I don't know what to do with that, but that's my sense. That's what I want to start with. I was thinking about this is just a comment, and I was just something that came to mind, and I just thought I'd share it since we're here. I was thinking about Aristotle's book Beta when he's listing all the problems, and he says, well, look, if we say all knowledge is based on particulars, we begin with what's one in number. And if we begin with what's one in number, how can we ground knowledge that's held in common, the universal? So that seems to be a problem. Well, if we start with just the universal, how do we get to the particular? Because the universal is in what, it's different in kind. It's what is particular is not one in kind. So how do I get one in kind? How do I get something that is not one in kind for something that is one in kind? So he says, I can't start with one and go to the other. It seems that I just need to already have both of them somehow. And I wonder if that's also the case in thinking about acquaintance as well. So it's just a comment. It's just an aporia Aristotle mentioned that seemed to have bearing on your research. So yeah, thanks so much. I hope there's a question or two in there. One for clarification about knowledge and acquaintance. Second one about particularity being essential to basically all acquaintance. And then Aristotle comment. So thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions and comments. And I'm curious to hear more about what you think, because in some cases, I don't necessarily have settled views, and I'd be curious to hear more. I mean, starting with the first thing, the kind of foundationalist argument you mentioned. I mean, Russell does give something like that argument, a kind of potential regress argument for thinking that it's got to bottom out in immediate knowledge. And it's not that I think it's very implausible. It's just that I wonder what ingredients are really going into some of like our a priori knowledge, and how do we arrive at that? Is it really all going to bottom out with, and I mean, I tend to think of acquaintance as primarily perceptual and introspective. Is it all going to bottom out there? Are all the necessary ingredients there, or is something going to be left out? So I guess I kind of go back and forth between thinking, yeah, maybe Russell's fully general kind of foundationalism is plausible, and there are these ingredients that can supply it through perception and introspection. and of particulars. But then being a bit hesitant about that just because I don't know, and I'm hesitant to add extra ingredients. I mean, like one of the things that when Chalmers kind of raised the thing at the World Congress, my immediate reaction was that like, ugh, acquaintance with universals, that seems weird. I don't want to be on board for something that seems utterly mysterious like that. So if you need acquaintance with universals in order to get that fully general foundationalism, then I'm a little bit more skeptical. Um, a great, interesting point about how a universal like blueness itself is a particular, and so if you're quaint, even if it's uninstantiated, you're aware of a particular. Um, I suppose it's just still, again, just to go back to the mysteriousness to me, or maybe I'm not getting there understanding wise. I have a hard time really wrapping my head around what that is. You know, aside from like looking into Plato's heaven, what particular am I acquainted with and how? Maybe I'm being obtuse, um, but yeah, it does sound plausible that it could be a particular. I mean, going back to the question about property instances, those also being universals. I mean, another way of thinking about them is they're just tropes, you know, particular properties, and they're not universals. And whether or not you believe that there are tropes, I think there's something nice about thinking of property instances that way that you're acquainted with, because it feels like in experience, it's like, yeah, that color, that shape, this thing, you know? Um, but yeah, that's a good point about blueness itself being a particular. As for Aristotle, yeah, I got to look into that. That's interesting to think that you would need both. And I wonder why. Yeah, so the argument for um, needing to have awareness of universals at the ground level because otherwise you can't, I guess, explain your knowledge of universals. Are we really confident it can't be done in other ways? Where it's like, you see this red thing, you see this red thing, you notice they look similar. And so in thought, you draw inferences. Is that a bad view?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it also, well, it depends on your view of induction and also your view on
Sure. Oh,
how
yeah, of course. Yeah.
universals comes about. So I think like early modern empiricism and then of course like Aristotle's view of it are very different. But yeah, I mean in beta, the paradox is put forward like, well, the universals themselves will be particulars. So if you say that knowledge is just the universal, then you won't even have an account of the universals. But if you say it's just particular, then you won't know the particulars because you need universals for that. So he assumes that you need universals to have knowledge, which we
Okay.
might disagree with that, right? But I think maybe another way to motivate that point would just be to say that maybe to riff on the first question again, maybe we'd want to say something like, to be acquainted with the particular is just to be acquainted with an instantiated universal. That means that every act of acquaintance, no matter what it is, like my inclination would be to say, is that it is particular. There's always some particular there. And I don't know that, but that just means an instance of a universal of some kind.
What about objects?
I think those are also instances of universals. Yeah.
Huh.
Like
Like
being
you
an,
and me?
yeah, like being an object is universal. Yeah.
But being the particular, being Matt Duncan isn't a universal.
Okay, yeah. So being Matt Duncan becomes more difficult. Yeah. So thisness, if I were to then become, thisness, yeah, things get hairy. Now we're in Hegel's phenomenology territory at the beginning. But yeah, so but even there, saying what it is you're referring to, speaking about it does seem to require It's operating like this, like an indexical. So I don't know. I think a case could be made that even the individual requires a universal somehow.
What
But
was that? So why is speaking about it require universal? I mean, I get how if you're like saying sentences and attributing properties,
yeah,
that is that what you mean? Like
yeah,
just a
basically that's
predicate? Yeah.
yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so then if you ask what it is, what are you acquainted with? And then you place that into propositional form, then the articulation in the philosophical discourse will instantiate some kind of universal. This may not be the same thing as the actual being acquainted with, right? This is the articulation of the acquaintance relation. Anyway, I didn't mean to go on the rabbit hole here.
No,
I'm just
yeah. I mean, I'm curious about this, and
Aristotle.
I also wonder why.
Yeah.
I mean, I am inclined to think it's very important, the idea that acquaintance is itself a kind of knowledge.
Yeah, right,
And
right.
that we have it and it's non-conceptual. Of course, it's importantly related to all that articulation that comes.
Yeah.
But I really want to like draw a divide there and say, well, articulation may require universals. And yes, thought and language and all of that. There's something prior and more basic that doesn't.
I see. So like the immediate relation to the object in acquaintance, um, this is doesn't necessarily require a universal.
Yeah.
Okay, so even the object of acquaintance, like what you're acquainted with, being a particular, doesn't require a universal. At least
Right.
one. I see. So on your view, you're inclined to say acquaintance is this immediate relation to an object. Um, this can be an immediate relation that doesn't require any universals. I see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this is something that I think I would strongly disagree with you on this one.
Okay.
Because even yeah, but anyway, I'll leave it here. But yeah, this is very helpful conversation. Very helpful
Well, I
discussion.
would be curious at some point to hear the source of strong disagreement.
Yeah, I think I don't want to repeat myself. I think it has to do with the very idea of what is a particular in the first place,
Yeah,
right?
I
So
see.
what is it? Back to the first question that Jakob asked. I think that a particular is just an instance of universal or instantiated property. So by my lights, there's nothing there without a universal. That may be an ontological commitment that is kind of
Yeah.
gonna get us into the weeds, right? Uh, so I don't know. On the
Well,
one,
right. I mean, let's suppose that it's like my experience. Let's suppose forget all the concepts, all the thinking, all the articulation. It's just this tapestry of tropes
oh, I
that
see.
I'm aware of. Um, that's a metaphysical commitment too, but I'm
That
just
is.
saying, as far as acquaintance goes, that seems to capture what's going
Yeah.
on, in my view.
Yeah. So I don't think my view is the only one, right? So I totally accept that. It's just a question of what is it that enables to kind of take the Husserlian line from something like formal and transcendental logic. What enables my capacity to articulate
Yeah.
the acquaintance relation is that there is a universal that's implicitly at work that then I make explicit, right? So I think that's kind of that would be how I would work backwards from what enables me to articulate it, right? It's that it's already implicitly operative. And that's also what enables it to be true. But we don't need to adjudicate this issue now, but I think, yeah, the trope assumptions do the work just as well as you say.
Or also, I mean, I know like Uriah Kriegel, who's a fan of the particular view. I mean, I think he either leans or is a nominalist.
Yeah,
And so um and I think there's some in terms of the story of how you then articulate facts about this blue pencil and its color and shape, um, I find myself open-minded to different
Good,
metaphysical commitments that would get there at different stories. I don't know.
good. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much.
Thank you both. This is the unfolding of the discussion I have been imagining when I suggested Matt's name. So it's because actually, from an Hegelian standpoint, it is very counterintuitive. I mean, this is very anti-Hegelian in a way. This standpoint. That's what makes it so interesting. I believe there's Jakob with another question, and then if there are no others, I also have a couple of remarks. Jakob, please.
Okay, thank you. Now I know how to raise the hand. I must like it's interesting discussion. I must side with Matt because look, the real issue is how we get or between direct acquaintance with our experiences and conceptualizing it as instantiation of universals. This is, I think, the real issue. So if we allow, or we cannot, I think, uh, suppose that all our experiences are always involving something universal, instantiation universal. This is the second step, as Matt said, it's conceptualizing it. If you want to describe it, I have a direct experience with color, or but to conceptualize it as an experience with blue or with blueness, whatever, is the second step, and uh, it's again it's something which can be taught as a uh, produced by my awareness of by my like conscious activity of my mind. So this is I admit this is anti-Hegelian view, but I think it's we can bring it back to Hegel's disagreement with Fichte, where exactly Fichte said, like, if we negate our direct experience, then after negating our uh, direct experience with something, we can express it as something, as an object, as something blue or something. So I think what the trope theory does is they uh, they do it some like for free. They presuppose it that we always experience something as uh, something singular as always being subsumed under something universal. And I think this is we cannot presuppose it. We must explain it somehow. And this is, I think, the real issue. So that's my.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the way you described it is how I intuitively think about the relationship between acquaintance on the one hand in perceptual and introspective experience, and then universals, thinking, articulation, language. There's all this recent work about the border between perception and thought, and so Ned Block's got that new book on that. So, I don't know whether or not the divide is so neat. You can kind of get these different, and I tend to think of, yeah, you have immediate experience, it's with it particulars, and then you got concepts that are used to carve that up and think about that, and that's where universals come in at some point. I don't know enough about Hegel or Fichte to say anything about that, but that is a kind of, and I just wonder that kind of psychological story, and in thinking about it from adults, also just thinking about developmentally, think about infants, what their capacities, how they develop, how maybe other animals. Um, I wonder what is implausible about that story, that the our access to universals comes in via thought, which is an extra layer.
Yeah, I think one of the questions is about the access to the universal.
Mm-hmm.
right? And the properties that things have as such. Those are the two different issues. So by my
Yeah.
lights, it can only have a property. It can only instantiate a property because there's a universal that's instantiated. So something's an object, it's instantiating the universal being an object. And that's different from my ability to access that universal, right? So I may be acquainted with something without necessarily being able to articulate, maybe, I don't know, the universal content, right?
Yeah.
Just like my cat can be acquainted with, I don't know, her food without telling me about the structure of
Yeah.
the food, right? So this is two separate issues, I think, completely, actually. When it comes
Okay.
to the instantiation of a property that enables something to have a determinate existence is one thing. It's another thing to articulate that or to have the capacities, as you say, to articulate those determinate structures. And I think one can accommodate, so it's a difficult issue because I imagine that the response to Jakob's defense of the particular first view or something would just be to, say what it is that this particular is, but don't appeal, at least not even implicitly, to a universal. Explain exactly what this particular is that you're intuiting without having to implicitly appeal to a universal. And of course, one can't really do that. One can perform it. One can just be acquainted without saying anything. But that's not that wouldn't be an answer.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing you said, I totally tracked with. I mean, I see it, those are two conceptual issues, but if you really do are careful to distinguish them and not let them
Yeah.
mix up with each other, then it seems to me that it's all riding on some background metaphysics. And
Yeah.
so the key question is going to be what's the argument for that?
Exactly.
But then some of the things that you said made it seem like this point about articulation and access really is part of the motivation for the metaphysics, because you say, like, how can you even name these things or talk about them without appealing to a universal? And if you, like me, think, well, look, there's this pre-conceptual, pre-linguistic, pre-articulable thing that is knowledge by acquaintance, then you're cheating by asking me to name something.
Definitely is cheating. Totally cheating. Yeah, but I think, yeah, it's the relationship is yeah, there's a lot to be said and a lot to be acquainted with here. Alex, you've been so
Let's
patient, letting us just hog the conversation.
no, absolutely. No, it's exciting. We just have another question by Jakub Mialik. So please, Jakub.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. I'm afraid my question is, I've been really focused on this fascinating exchange, and my question is sort of about a more minor point that Matt made. It's about this relation between acquaintance and certainty. And I guess my question is more clarificatory. I just wondered, because I always used to, when I thought about these things, I thought about acquaintance as sort of contrasting with like representation. And there is a real sense in which representation can present to me whatever when I have a mental representation, it can be presented to me that I'm like experiencing green color, and really the target of the representation is red color, even though it like misrepresents the red color. And acquaintance I always thought of like as more direct and kind of allowing me a sort of certainty in some sense, in some maybe pre-conceptual, pre-classificatory sense. And so I was really interested in your take, which I thought was very interesting, and you brought in, matrix and simulate, simulations, and so the way I think about it is, if with respect to like simulated reality, if I take the Chalmers line, say, I, even if so I think I'm acquainted with a chair. I find out I'm in a matrix, and if Chalmers is right, then I'm still, in some sense, acquainted with a chair, although it's just a digital chair. But like, I guess a more widespread line is, it's an illusory chair. It's not a simulated chair. It's not a real chair. And so then I would say I'm not acquainted with a chair. So if I am acquainted with a chair, then acquaintance does guarantee, it seems to me, a sort of certainty. But maybe I'm missing something. So this was just my thought about that.
Yeah, so you're specifically wondering about, okay, I'm in a simulation and I'm having a chair experience. There's no like physical object there as we think. I'm inclined to think what you can be certain of and what you are acquainted with is your own experience. Anything beyond that is going to involve knowledge by description, and knowledge of truths. And so, you can, and error is going to be possible once that comes in, because that involves conceptualizing something as a chair. And you can make mistakes like that, whether or not you're in a simulation. And so the further question about whether it's correct to conceptualize that as a chair. I guess it gets into those tricky issues that Chalmers writes about with, the meaning of our terms being, fixed by, what's around us. And if we're in a simulation, then maybe we should say that that's what a chair is. But I think if we're past the realm of certainty when we're talking about what is and isn't a chair, for sure. I mean, the issue of certainty, I'm very interested in it, in part because the way that has been construed so far in the recent literature, is under the assumption that knowledge by acquaintance is constituted by beliefs that just depend on acquaintance. And so, Chalmers and Gertler and others, myself in a previous life, really twist and turn to try to explain how you can have this kind of infallibility while still thinking about the relevant knowledge as propositional. And maybe there is some of that knowledge that's propositional, but I think we need to, if we're taking seriously the idea that knowledge by acquaintance is its own sui generis kind of knowledge, then we got to conceive of certainty differently. And that's something I want to work on. This kind of development beyond the book.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. If I may just have a short
Sure.
thing to say very briefly. I just thought that if you pose the question, and I'm now less sure that you posed it in that way, does like acquaintance with X give me certainty that there is X? I think what you just said kind of you see, that didn't rule it out. I think, sorry, what you just said didn't rule out that acquaintance with an X doesn't sorry, that acquaintance with an X gives me certainty that there is X. It's just that I cannot be sure that I'm acquainted with an X.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. So that's my point, and that's kind of I guess a newish point, maybe something that people hadn't really explored. But I think yeah, that's right. Acquaintance by itself doesn't deliver the certainty, because Well, because acquaintance is a relation, so it guarantees the existence of both relata, the subject and the
Yes.
object. So if I'm really am acquainted with X, X exists. But still, I think there could be a scenario where I am acquainted with X, but I can't be certain that X exists because I can't be certain that I am acquainted with X.
Yes, yes.
And that's where the phenomenal indistinguishability comes in. But I just think that's precluded when it comes to knowledge of your own experiences.
Yeah, that was a very nice point. Thank you. Very much.
Thanks.
Oh, many thanks, Jakob and Matt, for the generous answers. If there are no other questions or remarks, I have just a couple of things that also closely relate to what you've been discussing with Gregory. I also have this habit of trying to relate questions to the history of philosophy, but just because, I mean, it's a deformation in some way, but also, let's see what the classics have said. And I was also thinking about Aristotle, but not about book beta of metaphysics. I was thinking about uh, the anima, where Aristotle says something that maybe is closely related to this whole discussion you've been having about non-conceptual knowledge. So Aristotle happens to call knowledge conceptual knowledge. So, but maybe that's a vocabulary problem, so to say, because in the De Anima, Aristotle says something which is very interesting, namely that our senses make judgments. So there is some, so to say, a faculty of discrimination and of distinction that is already embedded in our senses and that requires no conceptualization. And this created a beautiful tradition. David Summers wrote a beautiful book on this, about the judgment of the senses, which is maybe a way of conceptualizing what you've been saying about, so to say, being able to have some sort of non-conceptual pre-linguistic knowledge. The problem is there is then another Aristotle, so to say, and it is the Aristotle of Book Theta that says sensation is uh, it is about the certainty of sensation, but in a way, I mean, the way how Aristotle states that is, you cannot be wrong about sensation. You can only be wrong about how you judge what you're sensing. So you can only be wrong about how you then conceptualize what you're sensing. So in that way, uh, acquaintance, if it's a good translation, is certain because it's simply because you cannot be wrong about it. I mean, you either have it or not. It is not possible to be wrong about it. But then, so I wanted to ask you first of all if this is maybe a way of understanding the problem. It is related to maybe a second problem which you have been discussing, in particular with Jakub Macha, which is so I believe that part of the problem and part of the way of the reason why acquaintance is mysterious in a certain way is that as soon as you try and talk about it, you're already outside of it. So as soon as you're trying to speak about it, you're no longer uh, in that modality of experience, in that modality of knowledge. So the problem is every form of description of acquaintance is a form of ekphrasis, is a form of, so to say, transmedial, transmodal description of what you've been experiencing. And maybe what is tricky about it is being able to clearly differentiate between your description of the experience and what is the experience, so to say. And so maybe that's also what the problem was about, so to say, the metaphysical assumptions that are behind, or the cheating you've been talking about. Because of course, it is cheating to ask to describe the experience without recurring to universals, but it is maybe not cheating to ask and describe the experience without making reference to anything that requires some sort of universalization. So maybe those are two different things. And I'd say this is maybe the core. The third thing is maybe the core of the problem I have with this acquaintance of universals or acquaintance of particulars discussion is, in a way, my impression is that what you're doing is, or the frame reference of this discussion is the idea that there are two kinds of objects: individual objects and universal objects. And maybe, I mean, one possible way of responding to this frame reference, or maybe a way of criticizing this frame reference, is maybe saying, if you're thinking about objects, you're thinking about individuals. If you, I mean, if there are no individual and universal objects, there are objects. And if you are, so to say, objectifying universals, you're already making them into particulars or into individuals. That was a little bit my impression. Maybe that's a third problem that can be summarized. So, in summary, three things. First of all, Aristotle, this idea that there is some sort of form of judgment that is non-conceptual. Second, the problem of the description of something that is per se non-linguistic, non-mediated by concepts, non-mediated by language. Third, the problem of the frame reference, and so of the possibility to address universals and to understand them as universal objects. Those were my doubts. But again, thank you, Matt.
Yeah, great thoughts and questions here. First, regarding Aristotle, yeah, in the sense of judgment of the senses, there's something about that I love and something about that I don't love. The thing that I love is that I think, yeah, the senses are, in a way, are like thought in that they are committal. They say, well, I don't know if I want to say, but they're committal about the way the world is. They rule out certain possibilities, just in the way that if you believe that P, that rules out the possibility that not P. And I think that's a really important point. I would just, and here's the point, I don't like to get that mixed up with terminology like judgment or saying or that kind of thing, because I do want to insist that this is a different way of the mind
Yes.
being in contact with reality, and it's non-propositional, it's non-thought. Yeah, you want to.
So, sorry, just for clarification, Aristotle used the verb krino, and krino just broadly means make difference. So it means discriminating. So judgment is not the word he uses, so to say.
Right, yeah, you were referencing someone else's work that used that terminology. So, right, I'm all on board for that. It also sounds a bit like Buddhist epistemology. I guess they've got some ideas like this, that yeah, the conceptualization, but the thing itself is certain. I'm on board for all of that, and I just think it's interesting, and maybe this is a sociological point about recent philosophy and epistemology in particular, and people's concerns about certainty claims. It seems like a lot of them are presupposing that knowledge requires judgment, belief, propositions, and so it really just doesn't even make sense to talk about certainty without talking about those things. And then once you've got those things, it's doubtful that you've got certainty. And so, yeah, one thing I definitely want to explore is alternative ways of articulating it that don't rely on that presupposition. And then I think it's a different ball game. But I like the Aristotle picture for sure. This point about where the mystery comes from. As soon as you start speaking about it, then you're outside of it. Maybe this is a terminological point, but I think I guess that's mysterious, but it also feels so commonplace that, I mean, I tend to think of language as this tool we use, and it's imperfect. Like we have limited powers of articulation. We have experience, which gives us things presented in a certain way. You know, people who like to talk about format stuff and say it's got an analog format or iconic format or something like that. It's presented in a certain way, and a language, which again, if you're going with format, is digital or discursive or something like that, and it's just not going to be up to the task of describing everything. Is that mysterious? I don't know if that's mysterious any more than saying like, you know, pointing out other limitations that we human beings have cognitively isn't up to the task of describing something as mysterious. There seems to be, and I get it. I feel like, and I wonder again sociologically, what kind of presuppositions are lurking in the background here, that we tie up mystery so much with whether we can write it on the whiteboard. And it's like, well, I don't know. Like some of this stuff is not mysterious. It's like everyday life. And yeah, we can't communicate it, but that seems like a commonplace. We know that kind of thing. Now there is a related point, and maybe this is the third thing. I mean, you were talking about it doesn't just about language, but maybe there are other ways in which universals are going to have to creep in. And yeah, this is an important point. One of my arguments for knowledge by acquaintance being itself a kind of knowledge is based on its role in reasoning. And one premise in that argument is that some bases of knowledge conferring inferences are not propositions we believe, they're properties or objects that we're aware of. So some examples I like, those mental rotation tasks where you're asked, is this the same figure as that? And they're just rotated relative to, and so you're like doing this imagination. There are other examples like that where I think really plausibly you are reasoning, but you're not reasoning with beliefs. So you're reasoning with like the contents of perception or introspection. And I even am somewhat tempted by the idea that there are like something like inference rules for knowledge by acquaintance. But maybe that there's no sense to be made of things like inference rules or reasoning with knowledge by acquaintance without universals. I'm not sure. I mean, does it take universals to mentally rotate a figure and be like, oh yeah, I can just see. I know I'm articulating it and that's universals, but you get the point there. You can just see that is that. Does that require universals? I don't know. I don't know if I covered
definitely see
everything,
the point.
Alejandro.
Mhm. No, I definitely see the point. It's very exciting. So thank you. And thank you for the answers.
I
Well,
enjoyed that last exchange about whether the everydayness is mysterious or not. I really appreciated that last exchange. It reminded me also of some kind of Buddhist, monks who the enlightenment is like sweeping the floor. You're like living into the mystery or the lack of mystery of everyday life or something. That's the true
Yeah.
acquaintance with the broom and the cup and that kind of stuff. But anyway,
I
yeah.
do
of
think,
course.
I mean, I do think the everyday has mysteries. And I think acquaintance, it's a mystery. Like, there are these acquaintance requirements that show up in various. I mean, Alessandro, you commented on this chapter of mine. It's about aesthetics, and there, in the aesthetic literature, they talk about acquaintance with the artwork itself is required for aesthetic appreciation and knowledge. I think that's there's a mystery there. Like, why would that? Why do you have to hear Bach in order to appreciate Bach? It's testimony wouldn't. I think there are mysteries there, but then there are other things that I think are mere philosophers' mysteries that they find mysterious because of
Yeah,
I
because
don't
of
know,
who
their
you are.
theoretical presuppositions. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably right. Yeah, that's probably right.
Mysteries wrapped in other mysteries. Well, if there are no other remarks or commentaries or comments or questions, there are not. Matt, thank you. This was very exciting, a very beautiful exchange. I had so much fun and I learned a lot as well. And we hope to see the book coming as soon as possible so that
Me
we can
too.
read it.
Yeah,
The
well, thank
title
you
will be
so
Just
much for having
Acquaintance,
me.
or
Yeah. The title is going to be Present to the Mind, Acquaintance and Its Significance.
Perfect. So Oxford University Press, hopefully 2025. So we'll be your first readers. Again, thank you all. We will start again. The next session of our seminar will be March 27, I believe, with Miriam Schau, who will speak about French thought. And the title is Singularity as the Scandal and Exemplarity as the Remedy of Aesthetic Theories with regard to philosophy. So it will be a different topic, but this will be an ongoing discussion. And again, thank you all for participating. Thank you, Matt,
Thanks,
and
Matt.
see you next time.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye bye.